Hey folks, this is Vince with Dad's Gaming Addiction, and today we're going to take a very quick look at the game Monopoly Electronic Banking Edition. Now this game is for 2 to 6 players, ages 8 and up, and the average play time is between 1 and 2 hours. Now this version of Monopoly plays a lot like the standard edition, with the exception of the money. You won't actually have paper money in this game. Everything is done via this electronic banking unit. Now let's just take a quick moment to look at the rules briefly and see how the game is played. Now I'm not going to spend too much time on explaining the rules, just because Monopoly's been around for such a long time, and most of you already know how to play it. But for the benefit of those who have not played Monopoly, I'll just simply say that this is one giant real estate game. Players will be buying properties throughout the game and hoping that the other players will land on those properties. When that does happen, the players that land on another player's own property will have to pay rent. And that is the main goal of the game. You're trying to force your opponents into bankruptcy, and the last player standing will win the game. Now, in this particular edition, everything is pretty much the same. You've got your community chest and your chance cards, which are drawn as players land on these spaces on the board. You've also got houses and hotels. Again, nothing new with those. For those that have never played Monopoly before, when one player manages to collect all of the properties of a particular color, they can add houses and hotels onto these spaces to increase the amount of rent that a player will have to pay whenever they land on them. Now you also have these title deed cards, and they function the same way as they do in the other Monopoly editions. Though it's important to note that the locations are different. Just like in most Monopoly versions, the locations are usually changed in some way. The Star Wars Monopoly, for example, has a bunch of Star Wars locations. In this particular version, there's a lot of landmarks that are in everyday life today. For example, O'Hare International Airport, Fenway Park, Boston, and Times Square, New York, instead of Boardwalk and Park Place. You've got places like Las Vegas, Hollywood, the Gateway Arch, and so on and so forth. And for those of you that haven't played Monopoly before, these are given to players as they buy properties on the board. There's one of these cards for each of the locations, and these will help players keep track of what properties each player owns. Now, as far as the player pieces go, you've got 6 of them. Again, the game is for 2 to 6 players. And I apologize if it looked like there were more pieces than are actually shown here. I actually had other pieces from another version just lumped into this one, just because we were missing some pieces from the other version. So we just decided to put those pieces here and use them. But in this particular edition, you've got 6 pieces. You've got a baseball cap. You've got a big screen TV. You've got a box of Altoids. Everyone loves Altoids. You've got a purse with a dog in it. I'm guessing that might have belonged to Paris Hilton. A space shuttle. And I believe this is a Segway. And of course, you've also got 2 dice. The game comes with these. Players will be rolling these throughout the game to move their character piece around the board. And finally, we come to the meat and potatoes of the game. You've got the electronic banking unit, and along with that comes electronic banking cards. And as you can see, they're color-coded on the right-hand side, so players can keep track of which cards belong to who. Now, this might appear to be a little intimidating, but it's actually pretty easy to use. Whenever you're setting up the game and you're about to play it, what you'll do is you'll hold in the C button in the lower left. That'll reset everyone's monetary value to 15 million. That's the amount that everyone starts with at the beginning of the game. Alright. It might take a second or two to register. There we go. 15 million. Now, in order to use this thing to give players money and to take away money, the player in question will go ahead and either put their banking card on the positive side or the negative side, depending on whether or not they want to receive money or take away money. And there's an arrow here to help guide you as far as which way the card should be facing. For example, let's say that this player received this community chest of 450K. he would simply slide the card into the slot, and the current balance on the card will come up. And the card calls for 450K, so we'll go ahead and type 450, and there's a K button up here, so you just hit that. And 450K is now added to the balance. And you just simply take the card out. And let's say you want to take away money. You just put the card in the negative side, the current balance will show up, and let's say that this person got this card. Pay 1.5 million in fines. So you just type in 1.5 and then hit the M, and that value is subtracted away. Now let's say you passed go and just want to register that. You just put that in on the plus side. There's the balance, and you hit this middle button. There you go. Now let's say for the moment that you want to record a transaction between two different players. Let me grab another card here. Now let's say for the moment that the yellow player landed on one of the blue player's properties and has to pay, and let's just take a look at Jacob's Field real quick. Let's say that yellow has to pay blue a rent of 20K. In this case, you would just put the paying person on the negative side and the receiving person on the positive side. 20K. It'll subtract 20K from this one and add 20K to this one. There you go. You just take the cards out and you're done. Now, I mentioned earlier that I wasn't going to get too much into the rules just because most of you probably already know how to play it. But for the benefit of those that have never played the game before, I just want to briefly touch on some of the highlights. For example, as these player pieces land on these spaces, and if no one owns them, they can go ahead and pay the price on the bottom of the space to collect the appropriate title deed card, which are represented here. For example, you've got Texas Stadium Dallas for this, and if that space shuttle were to buy that property, he would receive this title deed card. And as you can see, if another player lands on that space, he'd have to pay the space shuttle player 40K. If that player had houses or hotels on them, the other players would have to pay a bit more. And in order to build houses and hotels on the properties that you own, you have to own all of the properties of that color. So this space shuttle would have to own both Texas Stadium and Jacobs Field. Once that player has both properties in this case, the card will usually tell you how much it'll cost to buy houses for that property. Houses in this case cost 500K each, and hotels cost 500K each, plus 4 houses. So you'll have to keep that in mind. Different properties have different costs, so you'll have to pay attention to the cards in question and see how much everything costs and how much it'll set you back to invest on those properties. Another thing worth quickly mentioning, if a player lands on a property but doesn't want to actually pay the money down here to buy it, in this case, let's say the space shuttle landed on this space but doesn't have the money or just doesn't want to buy it, they can instead put it up for auction. And the banker, one person is assigned as the banker in the game, will go ahead and perform an auction to see who would want the Mall of America property. And auctions pretty much work the same way as they do in real life. The banker will call out an amount, and players can go ahead and raise their hand or just call out saying that they want a piece of that, and so on and so forth, until the highest bid, no one challenges the highest bid, and whoever has the highest bid will claim the card. And then that player would have to pay that bid to the bank. Well, as I mentioned earlier, players will be making their way around the board, buying properties in the hopes that other players land on said properties in order to collect rent. Initially, the rent will be pretty low. However, as the game progresses, players will be able to put houses and hotels on these properties and build them up, and landing on these spaces will become more and more expensive. And that's really how you knock players out in this game. Let's just say, for example, that the space shuttle here lands on Disney World owned by another player and has to pay rent. And there may come a point where said shuttle will not have the funds necessary to pay the rent whenever they land on these spaces. What they can do instead is take a look at the titles the cards that they do have. Let's say that this player owns what is this? Johnson Space Center. They can go ahead and mortgage. They could flip this card over to the other side and receive 900K back. Now, what will end up happening is that this card will be flipped over, and anyone that lands on this space will no longer have to pay rent until the owner of this property or the space shuttle is able to pay the money to flip this back over. It's basically this times 10%. So that's one way a player can get out of being eliminated from the game. But eventually there's going to be a point where selling all of the hotels and all of their houses and all of their property isn't going to be enough to cover the cost of landing on some of these spaces. And there you have it. This is just a very quick look at the game Monopoly Electronic Banking Edition. You can check out my review at www.dadsgamingaddiction.com, or you can simply click on the link in the below description. That'll take you there as well. This is Vince, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.